Hey, I'm Patrick Macias. I am the author of the book Tokyo Scope, the Japanese cult film companion, and today we're going to talk about Orgies of Edo. To talk about Orgies of Edo, we have to talk about Pinky Violence, the genre in which this movie is a part of. Pinky Violence is a retroactive term for a group of films that came out from Toei Studios from the late 60s to the early 70s. Lots of films, many directors, although kind of the best known, most associated one is Teruo Ishii, who directed Orgies of Edo and directed the very first Pinky Violence movie, Tokugawa Onna Keizan from 1968. Okay, so meanwhile, in the late 60s, Japanese movies weren't where they used to be. People were kind of leaving the cinemas behind in droves to stay home and watch TV. And meanwhile, independent producers were making pink movies, sex films, and Toei also had set up their whole operations for several years based around the Yakuza movie, the gangster movies. So when the bottom line wasn't quite what it used to be, Toei top producer Shigeru Okada, who was later going to become the president of Toei, said, let's cross the Rubicon, let's do it, let's make big budget for then, gorgeous, erotic period films. That was the mandate. And that's what he did. And Teruo Ishii was the guy to direct the first one, Tokugawa Onna Keizan from 1968. Ishii has like a long career. We'll get into all that in a bit. But he had just come off directing 10 films in 2 years for the Abashiri Prison series with Takakura Ken, and he needed a break. He wanted to do something new. He was the right guy for the job. Okay, so Ishii directed, 8 Pinky Violence movies for Toei in, I guess it was over a several year span. Teruo Ishii's, grotesque, weird, perverted, deranged imagination was inspired to a large degree by Rampo Edogawa, the famous Japanese mystery suspense writer. Ishii would later, of course, adapt Rampo Edogawa's works into several films. And, for my money, Ishii is, he's obviously not like a great director. When he's at his most freakish and his weirdest, he's the contemporary of someone like a Fellini or like a Hortokowski, someone who can just suddenly give you deranged, messed up, dreamlike imagery that's going to haunt you and stay with you. And there's plenty of that in Orgies of Edo. A lot of other directors from Toei made pink films, sometimes against their will, sometimes their contracts were manipulated. Sometimes the old-timers who'd been at the studio for a long time making samurai movies suddenly confronted with the sight of group, sex scenes, group nudity, refused to work on these films, would protest, and basically viewed Ishii and this whole mandate towards Toei porno as a bad thing. For having all these really extreme ideas, extreme images, erotic, grotesque things going on in his movies, he had the full support of the studio executives behind him. They were saying, go off the leash, make a crazy movie. These films did really, really well financially for Toei at a time when other genres were dying, such as the Yakuza film. There was a lot of money to be made in these films, and I think it's to their credit that they have so much quality to them. There's an aesthetic there. For example, like in the first segment in Orgies of Edo, where you have yards and yards and yards of fabric all laid out, and you have it's a huge space. And you have these tiny little characters, in the landscape. And everything is just beautifully lit, beautifully focused. Didn't have to be there. They didn't have to do that, but there it is. Also, there's other scenes contrasted with horrible torture of innocent, pregnant people. And you have snow falling, or you have flower petals, just these touches of aesthetics that I think connect Ishii. Ishii connects to the grindhouse exploitation, the rough stuff in Japanese cinema, to ukiyo-e, to traditional things you see in Japanese art. I think in some ways Ishii had to get wild. He had to get surreal and crazy and find ways to depict, physical extremity. Because if you're making a sex film and you can't really show genitalia, you can't actually show full contact sex, because even the pink films, even the independent films, were still strictly regulated by the Japanese authorities. Ishii had to get into things like armpit hair. There's a scene in the first segment in Orgies of Edo where the camera's pretty much just zooming in on a hairy armpit. I guess that worked for some people. And torture and bondage and all these things. It's the repression of not being able to show the sex act erupts. The return of the repressed. Things come out in weird ways, and suddenly you have sex dwarves and cesarean sections and all this messed up stuff that make Orgies of Edo pretty special. So it's like, which Taro Ishii are we talking about? His body of work, like, are we talking about the superhero movie director, the action movie director, the erotic grotesque director, the straight-to-video guy, the karate movie guy? I don't know. He contained multitudes. And at his best, some of the most awesome Japanese movies that I've seen under the cult movie flag. In Japan, he's actually referred to by some of the movie fanatics here as the king of cult movies. And, I mean, there's so many highlights. Personal favorites being, of course, Horrors of Malformed Men, Porno Jidaigeki, porno period film, and The Executioner starring Sonny Chiba. These are all fantastic movies. If you haven't seen them, like, by all means, run out and go see them. Born in Tokyo in 1924 and was raised in the Asakusa Ward, which was kind of the entertainment district, had a long tradition of sort of a carnivalesque atmosphere. And it's kind of always been a favorite haunt of like writers and artists, including Rampo Edogawa, a big influence on Taro Ishii. They had circus sideshows there. They had freak shows and stuff like that. It's not really until the late 60s when he's given the full resources of a studio that he's kind of allowed to explore that. Before then, he dropped out of prestigious Waseda University in his early 20s and began working at Toho Studios during the war, and became an assistant to Mikio Narase, a very famous Japanese filmmaker, and studied screenwriting under Sekizawa, Shinichi Sekizawa is one of the kind of major Godzilla screenwriters. And so during the war, he went to Manchuria and did some photography there, and then came back to Japan, worked at Shin Toho, which was New Toho, a splinter group off of the main Toho studios, that was a little more exploitation-minded, and he kind of made a name for himself with the Line series of films, which were kind of like spicy, sexy mystery stories, very urbane, very witty, starring Taro Yoshida, who plays the doctor in Orgies of Edo. He appears in several of the Line films. So he was one of Ishii's favorite actors. He appears as kind of the straight guy with all this kind of madness and craziness raging around him. He's kind of the rock in the center of it that holds it all together in several of Ishii's films, including Horrors of Malformed Men. And he went to Toei as Toei was just getting off the ground, and arrived during the chivalry film boom, kind of the chivalrous Yakuza movies. And he didn't seem like he was really into that sort of thing, but was nevertheless capable of delivering hit films within that context. And eventually kind of like met his match with Takakura Ken, then not really quite the movie star. He would become like the most popular Japanese action star. And Ishii was there to kind of help give birth to Ken the Star with the Abashiri prison series, which was 18 films total, 10 directed by Ishii in 2 years, which is crazy. So my image of Ishii is a guy who was like always working. I'm sure Toei must have been like just a crazy movie factory city. Owning their own theater chains, they had to release new double features every week. And at the time of Orgies of Edo, traditionally what it would be a Yakuza movie on the top of the bill and a sex movie on the bottom of the bill. But as the Yakuza genre was kind of waning, even though the sex films were usually kind of bottom billed, they usually ended up kind of grossing more than the Yakuza films of the time. When Shigeru Okada, the kind of head producer at Toei, later to become the president, was, giving Ishii the support he needed to kind of, create these period set exploitation films that Ishii, I think, kind of really comes into his own. And for like a 10-year streak, he's really I feel like delivering the goods. He's got like the right crew behind him. He's got the right subject material. He's actually co-writing a lot of these films too. You see other Ishii movies from an earlier time period or a later time period, and it can be kind of workmanlike. It can be kind of rough around the edges, although there can still be wild flourishes and things like slapstick comedy and just these incongruous mixture of styles. It's really, for my mind, 68 to like 73. Pretty much any Taro Ishii movie from that period is gonna kind of blow your mind at some point or another. The program pictures began dying down in the 70s, and Ishii did some biker films, co-wrote, co-directed an anime film, came back in the 90s as an independent director again, but with much lower budgets, although returning to some of the kind of more Rampo Edogawa crazy style imagery, reconnecting with some of the stars of the earlier era like Tetsuro Tamba, reconnecting with some of the subject matter like deformity, madness, surrealism, and sex. There's a tradition of kind of the cult auteur that never really gets his due in his lifetime. So Orgies of Edo is not a particularly well-documented film. There's not really a lot written about its making, its conception. It's seen as part of the 8 Pinky Violence movies that Taro Ishii made. What is known is that it was released in January of 1969. It's an anthology film, as were several of the earlier Pinky Violence movies that Ishii had directed and co-scripted. The first story about a woman who loses her virtue and has to work in a brothel in Yoshiwara is pretty... it was intentionally like kind of cliche. Like this is an oft-told story in Japanese popular literature. And the film gets progressively wilder as it goes on. I don't think Ishii really, the opening sequence, the title sequence with the Buto dancing is obviously like, it's a tip-off, we're going to go into some wild territory. But the film really begins to play it straight for the first segment, although there is some rough stuff. The second segment is when things get really crazy, when you have the sex dwarves and you have just the madness and the mania begins creeping in, and it never really leaves. The third story is one of my favorite kind of mini movies in the Ishii filmography, with the crazy lord, the crazy sadistic lord, played by Koike Asao, sort of pulling these faces, and the emotions are really big, and you're not going to see too many movies where you have sort of a room full of naked women and bulls with their horns on fire, gouging them. That's pretty special, let's face it. The actresses in Orgies of Edo are big names within the Pinky Violence genre, but are not like mainstream actresses. I don't think they could really get mainstream actresses to do the stuff that was required of the actors in this movie. Mari Tachibana is the girl in the first segment. She's the fallen girl who has to work in Yoshiwara. Made a lot of sex films at Toei. Was it Mitsuko Aoi is the girl in the second story, another Pinky Violence name. Look her up, a lot of spicy movies. The main performance in the film is Teru Yoshida, who's an actor who had worked with Ishitaro since the 50s in the Shintoho days. And later in Horror of Malformed Men, he's the straight guy. All the madness is sort of swirling around him. And you have, most strikingly, I think, Tatsumi Hijikata, the Japanese father of avant-garde Buto dancing. I think my personal favorite, the guy who would take home the award if I was handing them out for best performance in the film, would be Koike Asao as the wicked evil lord in the third film. He's a familiar face from countless Toei movies, a lot of Yakuza movies, especially the Battles Without Honor and Humanity series directed by Kenji Fukasaku. Just great mugging and enjoying the sadism and the torture. So, in a world of limitless pornography, anytime, any place, anywhere that we live in now, why watch The Orgies of Edo 40 years after its release in Japan? And the answer to that question is, well, it's really Taro Ishii's gift for the deranged, the grotesque, the weird, the messed up, that punctuates the simulated sex, the fake cesarean section delivered babies, all this stuff meshing together to create a strange atmospheric world that I don't think we're going to see the likes of anytime again soon, with the full resources of a studio known for making period Japanese films behind it. You get this combination of depravity, of Japanese aesthetics. It's really quite something special. There are other films in the pinky violent genre that are just as wacky and wild, but I think Orgies of Edo, particularly for being a precursor to Horrors of Malformed Men, which is one of Ishii's most major works, it's an important film for those reasons, to see how the groundwork was laid for that kind of bigger, better-known film. It's a step in that direction with a lot of the same staff and crew, and we'll never see its like again.